60 miles outside the epicenter of the nation's COVID-19 outbreak, cases exploded in Suffolk, one of the most populated counties in New York.
I look back and I say less than a month ago, life was normal here. We didn't have a single death in this county.
The eastern end of Long Island took a hard hit, becoming a hotspot next to its big city neighbor.
We are a suburban community, we're a rural community, and I think it's a lesson for the rest of America. If we can get hit the way we have here, this can happen anywhere. We're all in this battle together.
On the ground, it's a battle stretching to unlikely corners of the community. The Stony Brook University campus is now prepared to receive coronavirus patients under these triage tents as hospitals continue to be pushed to the limit. And it's not just a struggle to save lives, but to keep up with the dead. With space running out for bodies, the county had to find another location, and they had to do it fast. That's why they ended up here on this farm. Building 106 was once used for veterinary research with Cornell University, but now it's been transformed into a temporary morgue that can hold up to 300 bodies. Do you anticipate having to use this facility?
Yes, I do. I'm hoping that our use of it is going to be minimal, and that we're not going to be able to, that we're not going to have to use nearly the capacity. It wasn't until about 3 weeks ago when we were on a call with the New York State Mortuary Affairs, and we started hearing and about the state's preparation, when it kind of finally hit me that we might have to be ready for the possibility that decedents were going to need to have a place to stay other than, the typical places, the hospital morgues, the medical examiner's morgues. So the acceleration of this process that's really the most humbling thing of all. I mean, just how quickly it's progressed.
Thank you, be safe.
For heroes on the front lines, these boxes of critical supplies leave as soon as they come in.
Well, the number one item everybody needs is masks.
Is this your first time stopping by?
No, actually, this is my third time.
Strategies to win this war are now being decided while social distancing. Step inside the nerve center of this countywide response, and critical calls are handled virtually every day with state and White House officials.
As this executive order comes into effect.
As the county began mobilizing to address this public health emergency, it reached another level when officials in charge of addressing this crisis realized that the virus hit one of their own.
We had been prepping for a time when our first employee would be tested positive for the COVID-19 virus, and we put all these protocols in place about how we would shut down the office, get it cleaned out, send everybody home, and get it ready for people to be able to work again. I was shocked when the first employee in county government, and we have over 9,000 employees, was one of my deputy county executives that I worked side by side with in the office that basically took out our entire leadership team that had to be isolated, including myself.
And as the nation talks about reopening, safety is still the focus in Suffolk.
We're still in the fight of our lives here, and it is about trying to save every person that we can.
Leading through a crisis one day at a time.
Thank you for being away from your families today to keep this thing going.
And with so many unknowns.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.